All right, man, think about this for a second. When we talk about Jews and Christians, the wild thing is they actually come from the same root, like literally the same family tree. And it blows my mind how people don't really process that, because we're all so caught up in differences. But if you zoom out, it's like two big branches of the same tree, and that tree is Abraham, the dude who basically kicks off the entire narrative. He's like the OG patriarch, the starting point of this entire spiritual DNA chain. And from him, you get this promise, this covenant with God, and both Judaism and Christianity are basically extensions of that original deal. But then over time, they just evolved in different directions. Like two fighters that trained at the same gym but developed totally unique fighting styles, right? Like one went heavy on wrestling and the other went all in on striking, but they still got the same coach, the same fundamentals, and the shared origin story is right there in their sacred texts. Both are reading the same early chapters, the same stories about creation. About Noah, about Abraham's trials, about Moses pulling the people out of Egypt. Like all that is core content for Jews, and it's also the foundation for Christians. It's like they both tuned into the same first season of a show, and then somewhere around season 2 or 3, one group kept watching the spin-off, and the other one was like, nah, we're waiting for the main storyline to finish. But the DNA, the setup, Eidersprung, it's the same writer's room, the same mythos, and that's why you get these crazy overlaps. When Christians talk about the Old Testament, that's literally the Hebrew Bible, that's Jewish scripture. They're quoting the same verses, the same moral codes, the same idea that there's one God, not a bunch of gods throwing lightning bolts, but one universal creator who cares about justice and humanity. So it's wild to me that people treat them like they're alien to each other when in reality they're cousins, they're siblings. They're cut from the same ancient covenant. And once you start looking at it that way, you realize the fights, the wars, the separation. It's almost like family beef, two brothers that love the same dad but can't agree on what he really meant. Dude, the whole thing with sacred texts is just insane when you think about it, because Jews and Christians are literally pulling from the same source material, like they're quoting the same ancient scripts, but interpreting them in different ways. And that's where the split gets wild, because the Hebrew Bible, or what Christians call the Old Testament, that's basically the Torah plus the writings and the prophets, and that's the foundation. That's the bedrock of both traditions. And it's so trippy when you realize Christians didn't just make up something completely new. They took the Jewish scriptures and said, yo, this is still legit, this is God's word, but there's a continuation, there's a sequel, and that sequel becomes the New Testament, and that's where Jesus comes in. And now you've got these two camps reading the same first half of the story, but arguing about what happens next. It's like two fans of the same comic book series, both obsessed with the original issues, but one group is like, that's it, no spin-offs. The story is still building to a finale we're waiting on, and the other group is like, nah man, the sequel dropped, the hero showed up, and you just didn't recognize him. And that's exactly what's happening with these texts. So you get Christians reading Psalms, Isaiah, Genesis, all of it, and Jews are reading the exact same thing, except the Christians flip it and say all those prophecies, all that imagery, it was pointing to Jesus, while Jews are like, no way, we're still waiting for the Messiah. That wasn't him. And it creates this whole divergence of meaning while the pages themselves are identical. And it's even crazier when you look at how much influence these texts have had on law, morality, politics, culture, because both groups shaped entire civilizations by saying these words are divine, these commandments are absolute. Like, don't kill, don't steal, honor your parents, all that stuff, it comes from that same textual core. And when you think about it, The Bible and Torah aren't just religious manuals. They're like the original podcasts, man, ancient long-form conversations written down. Stories, debates, philosophies, and people have been tuning into them for thousands of years, interpreting them, remixing them, and building their identities around them, So at the end of the day, you've got two faiths holding the same script in their hands, but arguing about the ending like hardcore fans fighting on Reddit over which version of a show is canon, What's crazy about the moral framework thing is that both Jews and Christians are basically operating off the same rule book, Like the Ten Commandments, that's the backbone. That's the core software installed in both systems. And it's nuts because those rules weren't just random. They became the foundation for almost every Western law code and moral system we have today, like don't murder, don't steal, don't lie. Honor your parents, don't mess around with your neighbor's wife. All that. It's not just religious stuff. It's society stuff. It's how humans figured out how to live together without killing each other. And both Jews and Christians looked at that and said, yeah, that's divine law, that's the code from God. And then they built their whole moral philosophy around it. And the trippy part is you'll see the overlap even in charity, justice, and how you treat strangers, because both faiths emphasize giving. Like Judaism has tzedakah, which is this obligation to give to the poor, and Christianity is all about charity as an act of love. And at the end of the day, it's the same vibe. Take care of people, don't hoard everything, spread kindness. And the wildest thing is that these ideas got baked so deep into culture that even people who claim they're not religious, they're still living by these codes, like modern laws about perjury, theft, murder. It's basically just the Ten Commandments in secular language. And when you think about it, that's insane. That's something written thousands of years ago on stone tablets is still shaping how judges make decisions in 2025. And it goes deeper to, like both groups see morality not just as rules, but as a way to stay connected to God. So when Jews keep kosher or follow Sabbath, it's like a discipline thing aligning with divine will. And when Christians talk about following Christ's teachings, it's the same alignment. It's saying your life should reflect something higher than just instincts or selfishness. And in both systems, morality isn't just about avoiding bad stuff. It's about actively pursuing good, like love your neighbor, forgive, seek justice, and that's powerful because it's a shared language. Even if they argue over theology, the ethical DNA is the same. Like two martial arts styles that look different on the surface, but come from the same base principles, respect, discipline, balance, And when you realize that, you see that Jews and Christians aren't just cousins in faith, they're cousins in how they built the very idea of right and wrong. The whole messianic belief thing is wild, man, because this is where Jews and Christians are literally staring at the same concept, but seeing two completely different realities. Like they both agree on the idea of a Messiah, this chosen figure who's supposed to bring peace, justice, and basically fix the chaos of the world. But the disagreement is over who that person actually is. And that's where the split really happens. Because for Jews, the Messiah hasn't shown up yet. They're still waiting. They're looking at prophecy and expecting some future leader who's going to unite humanity, rebuild the temple, bring an era of global peace. And for Christians, it's like, nah, man, he already came. That was Jesus. The dude in sandals who flipped tables in the temple and preached love and forgiveness. And the argument basically turns into this giant cosmic debate over recognition. Like imagine a surprise guest fighter walking into the gym and half the people are like, that's the champ we've been waiting for. And the other half are like, nope, that's just another guy. The real champ is still on his way. So for Christians, the whole New Testament is proof that Jesus fulfilled those prophecies. They point to Isaiah, Psalms, all those ancient texts and say, look, it all lines up. while Jews are like, no, because the world is still broken. There's still war, port. There's still injustice. And if the Messiah had really come, the world would look totally different. So it creates this fascinating tension, sport. Like two people reading the same fight record, but interpreting the stats completely differently, port. And the crazy thing is both sides are still motivated by the same hope that the Messiah represents ultimate redemption, like the finish line of human struggle, and that's powerful because it shapes how they live now. Port. Christians see salvation as already unfolding through Jesus, while Jews are practicing their faith in anticipation of that moment still to come. Port. So both are future-focused in a way, but one says we're living in the aftermath of the Messiah, port, and the other says we're still in the build-up. And when you step back, it's kind of insane to realize that this one figure, this one concept, port, has defined the course of two of the biggest religions in the world, split civilizations, started wars, inspired art, philosophy, entire moral systems, port. And it all boils down to the question of whether the Messiah already walked the earth or whether we're still waiting for him to step into the arena. Sport, it's crazy when you start digging into the cultural overlap between Jews and Christians, port, because on the surface they look like two different teams with their own uniforms and playbooks. But if you look closer, you realize they're sharing a ton of the same DNA, like traditions, festivals, and even the rhythms of life. And it's wild how much cross-pollination there is. For example, a lot of Christian holidays are rooted in Jewish festivals. Sport, like Passover and Easter, are connected. One's about liberation from Egypt, the other about resurrection, but they both revolve around renewal, sacrifice, and freedom. And then Christmas, with all its themes of light and hope, has connections to Hanukkah, which is literally the festival of lights. So you see these echoes bouncing back and forth across centuries. And it's not just holidays, it's also practices. Like early Christians were basically Jews who still followed kosher dietary laws, kept the Sabbath, and gathered in synagogues before they developed their own identity. So you had this period where the overlap was so tight you could barely separate them. And even today you still see traces of that in rituals. Prayers and music, like the psalms Jews sing in Hebrew, are the same psalms Christians recite in church. Same words, different vibe. And the ethics around community life, like hospitality, honoring parents, burying the dead, celebrating milestones, they're almost identical in structure, just flavored differently. And another layer that blows my mind is how art and philosophy overlap, because both traditions wrestle with the same stories and heroes. Moses, David, Solomon, Isaiah, these are central figures in both worlds, and they inspire paintings, sculptures, and sermons for centuries. And then you look at law and culture in the West. Most of it came out of this Judeo-Christian fusion, like the idea of one God, human dignity, justice, charity, all these concepts that shape modern society, their shared cultural codes. And sometimes they even influenced each other directly, like Jewish mysticism feeding into Christian mysticism, or Christian theology borrowing from rabbinic debates, And the overlap is so big that you could almost argue the line between them is blurrier than people think. Because it's like two martial arts that started from the same root style and then evolved into distinct disciplines, but still share the same kicks, the same philosophy of balance and discipline. And even though they've had their rivalries and conflicts deep down the culture, the rituals, and the stories they carry are like family heirlooms being passed down through two different branches of the same family tree. Man, when you start talking about the historical struggles of Jews and Christians, it's like this long, brutal highlight reel of human endurance. Because both went through insane amounts of persecution, exile, and straight-up survival mode just to keep their identities intact. Like the Jews, their whole history is about being conquered, exiled, pushed around by empires. The Babylonians, the Romans, later the medieval kingdoms, and yet somehow they never disappeared. They kept the Torah alive. sport. They kept the traditions intact even when they were scattered across the globe, and Christians went through a similar grind in the early days. Like people forget that before Christianity became this massive global religion, the first few centuries were basically Christians getting thrown to lions, burned at the stake, hunted down for not bowing to the Roman gods. So both groups started off as underdogs in a world that wanted to crush them. And what's crazy is that both of them turned that suffering into fuel, like persecution became part of the identity, part of the story. And that's why it sticks. That's why they got so resilient. And then you look at later history and you see even more parallels. Jews facing pogroms, ghettos, the Holocaust, while Christians in certain eras were torn apart by their own internal wars, like the Crusades, the Reformation, Catholics versus Protestants, and it's just struggle layered on struggle, and yet here they are, still two of the biggest faiths on the planet, still shaping the world, still alive and thriving, and it makes you think about how suffering kind of forges strength, because if either group had just folded when the pressure came, we wouldn't even be talking about them today. And the bond here is that shared experience of being the outsider, the target, the minority under the boot of bigger powers, and it created this deep grit in both traditions. Like a fighter who's taken beatings but keeps coming back smarter, tougher, more disciplined. And maybe that's part of why their connection is so powerful, because their survival stories aren't just about faith. They're about human resilience, and when you see the parallel arcs, you realize they weren't just building religions, They were building legacies out of pain, out of resistance, out of a refusal to die, and that's why their histories still hit so hard today, because it's not just about God, it's about what humans are willing to endure to keep their truth alive. The thing about philosophical similarities between Jews and Christians is that when you strip away the labels and just look at the core ideas, you start realizing they're basically vibing on the same frequency. Like, both traditions are obsessed with justice, with this idea that the world isn't just chaos, that there's a moral order and humans have a role in protecting it. And that's heavy, because it means they both see life as more than just survival or pleasure. It's about meaning, about serving something bigger than yourself, And both of them hammer this point of community, like you don't exist just for you, you exist for your neighbor, for the poor, for the stranger. So generosity and charity aren't just nice gestures, they're obligations. They're baked into the DNA of both systems. And forgiveness, too, that's a big one. The idea that you don't let hate and grudges eat you alive, you try to repair, to make peace. And it's not just spiritual fluff, it's a psychological hack. Because when you practice forgiveness, you're freeing yourself from bitterness. And both Jews and Christians figured that out thousands of years ago. And another trippy similarity is the way they both wrestle with the problem of suffering, like why do bad things happen to good people? Why does it just God let injustice happen? And instead of running from that question, they both sit in it. They argue with God, they debate, they write about it, and that kind of raw honesty is a big part of both philosophies. Like Judaism literally encourages questioning, wrestling with the text, while Christianity encourages wrestling with faith. And at the heart of it, you've got this shared belief that life is a journey of growth, discipline, and striving toward holiness. Which sounds religious, but really it's the same idea you see in martial arts, in philosophy, in self-improvement. Be better, be more conscious, align yourself with the highest values you can imagine. And what's insane is both groups even share the same language sometimes, like love your neighbor as yourself, seek justice, walk humbly with God. That's not just a Christian thing or a Jewish thing, that's both straight out of the Hebrew Bible and repeated in the New Testament. And it shows how the philosophy underneath is more about universal human truth than tribal identity. like two schools arguing over techniques but training for the same fight, which is how to live a meaningful, righteous, and impactful life in a world that constantly tries to pull you off balance. Sport. Here's what blows my mind about the whole shared prophets thing. Jews and Christians literally look up to a lot of the same guys, the same legendary figures, like they're part of the same spiritual hall of fame, and yet each tradition frames them a little differently. But the overlap is undeniable. Like Moses, for example, both groups see him as the dude who brought down the Ten Commandments, who faced off against Pharaoh, who led the people out of slavery, and that story is central to both faiths. Then you've got David, the warrior king, the guy who slayed Goliath and wrote psalms that both Jews sing and Christians quote in church. And it's the same book, the same words, just different melodies. And then there's prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, all these heavyweights who talked about justice, warned against corruption, and gave visions of hope. And Jews and Christians are both reading their words. It's just that Christians are like, these verses point to Jesus, while Jews are like, no, that's about something else. But either way, they're both building sermons, rituals, and philosophies around the same dudes, and that's wild, because it means the moral and spiritual imagination of both religions is shaped by the same ancient voices. It's like two different bands covering the same classic songs, but with different arrangements. One's doing it acoustic and the other's doing it heavy metal, but it's the same lyrics underneath. And what's even crazier is that these prophets weren't just fortune tellers, they were social critics. They were standing up to kings, calling out injustice, demanding compassion for the poor, and both Jews and Christians took that message to heart. They just ran with it in different directions, but the respect is mutual. No one's out here saying Moses or Isaiah didn't matter. Both traditions treat them like legends, and that's where you see the shared DNA, because without these prophets, neither religion would look the same. It'd be like trying to talk about martial arts without Bruce Lee or Ali. The icons are too big to ignore. And it makes me think that even though Jews and Christians argue about how to interpret them, the fact that they're quoting the same prophets shows they're pulling inspiration from the same spiritual well, which is kind of beautiful if you think about it, because it means their arguments are happening in the same family living room, just on different couches. When you really dig into the interwoven histories of Jews and Christians, it's like watching two storylines in a show that start together, split into different arcs, but then keep crossing paths in ways that are dramatic, messy, and honestly pretty wild, because Christianity literally comes out of Judaism. The first Christians were Jews, Jesus was a Jew, his disciples were Jews, they prayed in synagogues, they celebrated Jewish festivals, and the early movement was basically a Jewish sect before it evolved into something else, And then over time you get this divergence where Christians start opening the door to Gentiles, non-Jews, and that's where the split starts. But even after that separation, their histories keep colliding, like the Roman Empire persecuted both of them at different times. Then later Christianity becomes the empire's official religion, and suddenly the power dynamic flips, and Jews are the ones getting pushed down. And you see this back and forth tension all through the Middle Ages with crusades, expulsions, ghettos, while at the same time Jewish philosophy and scholarship is influencing Christian thinkers and vice versa. Like they're fighting but also feeding off each other's ideas. And it's crazy because you can't tell the story of one without the other. Like Christianity doesn't even make sense without Judaism. It literally builds on the Hebrew Bible, and Judaism's historical journey gets completely shaped by living alongside Christian majority societies for centuries. So it's this constant dance of conflict, borrowing resistance and influence. And when you fast forward to modern times, You still see that interconnection, like the Holocaust and World War II reshaped Christian, Jewish dialogue, forcing churches to rethink old teachings about Jews. And then the creation of Israel brought a whole new layer of political and religious crossover. So even today, their destinies keep brushing up against each other. And I think what makes it so fascinating is that it's not a clean break story. It's not like one group went east and the other went west and never saw each other again. It's more like a family feud where everyone keeps living in the same neighborhood, bumping into each other at the store, sometimes fighting, sometimes sharing meals, but always connected. And that's why the phrase Judeo-Christian tradition even exists, because whether they like it or not, their histories are stitched together, tangled up, and you can't pull one thread without unraveling the other. What's wild about the whole modern tensions and bridges thing between Jews and Christians is that you're looking at two groups with this long, complicated history of beef, like centuries of mistrust, persecution, and misunderstandings, but at the same time, in the modern world, you see these surprising alliances and genuine attempts at reconciliation, and it's kind of mind-blowing to watch that play out, because on one hand, you've got the scars of the past, like pogroms, ghettos, forced conversions, the Holocausts, stuff that leaves a deep wound that doesn't just vanish because people shake hands. But on the other hand, you've got dialogues, interfaith conferences, and leaders from both sides stepping up and saying, look, we share roots, we share values, let's focus on that instead of rehashing the fights. And you see real bridges forming, like Christians openly acknowledging the Jewish foundation of their own faith, or Jewish scholars engaging with Christian texts without hostility. And then politically, it gets even more interesting, because in the last century, you've got strong Christian support for Israel, especially from certain evangelical groups, which creates this unexpected partnership, even though it's motivated by different theological angles. And culturally, there's this overlap too, like joint efforts in humanitarian causes, social justice movements, even philosophy. And it's fascinating because you can feel the tension and the healing happening at the same time. Like one moment they're clashing over theology or Middle East politics, and the next they're uniting over defending religious freedom or protecting moral values in a secular world. So it's like this constant push and pull, and it really shows how family like the relationship is, because no matter how bad the fights get, there's still this gravitational pull keeping them in orbit around each other. And in modern times, especially after events like World War II, the focus has been more on building bridges, acknowledging mistakes, and finding common ground. And while the tensions haven't disappeared, because let's be real, they're never going to fully vanish, what's new is this awareness that their shared history and shared moral DNA are too significant to ignore. So now you see rabbis and priests, Jewish and Christian thinkers sitting at the same tables, debating, collaborating. And that's kind of beautiful in a way, because it shows that even with all the baggage, the connection is stronger than the division. And maybe the modern story isn't just about tension, it's about proving that bridges can actually be built over some of the deepest historical divides. So here's the thing, man. After walking through all this, shared origins, the texts, the morals, the prophets, the struggles, all that, you start to realize Jews and Christians are way more connected than people like to admit. It's not just two random religions bumping into each other in history. It's literally one family tree branching out in different directions. Arguing over interpretation, beefing at times, but still drawing water from the same well. And the shocking truth isn't that they're different, it's that they're almost too similar. And that's what made the clashes so intense. Because it's like fighting with your sibling. The closer you are, the more heated it gets. But underneath all the conflict, there's this undeniable bond, this shared DNA that shaped entire civilizations. And when you zoom out, it kind of blows your mind that so much of our world, our laws, our ethics, our culture, even our debates about justice and peace, come from these two traditions feeding off each other, pushing against each other, but also keeping each other alive in a weird way. And maybe the real lesson isn't about who's right or wrong. Maybe it's just about acknowledging the connection, the roots, the shared story that goes back thousands of years, because once you see that, you can't unsee it. It changes how you think about religion, history, even humanity itself. And honestly, I hope whoever's listening takes that with them, because it's not just history. Sport, it's about us today, how we deal with difference, how we respect where we came from, and how we try to build something better going forward. So yeah, thanks for sticking with me through this deep dive. Good luck with wherever your own journey takes you. And seriously, thank you for listening. Means a lot, man.